we're going to talk about Post-Impressionism. I've said this before, but whenever you see post in front of a term in art history, you know you have entered into fudge territory. It means we don't really know what to call it. The only thing we can say for certain is that it is post, that it is after Impressionism, and it's a perfect description. Before this, we have styles or movements that are easily recognizable or identifiable by their technique, their style, their subject matter, what have you. But you can't do that anymore after Post-Impressionism. The only thing you can say is it's after Impressionism. It isn't unified by style. Some artists will go back to a classical academic style. Some artists will go in a completely abstract direction. It isn't unified by theme. Some artists are still representing narrative and symbolism and meaning. Others have gone to pure expression. There's really no unifying force under the collection of styles and techniques that emerge in the wake of the collapse of Impressionism at the end of the 1880s. And this is one of the things that makes this definitively modern art, that we're finally moving into an era that we can say is modern. That is, it is moved away from classical subject matter. Modernism is the deconstruction of the academic style. So we used to have kind of moldy oldies, classical subject matter, Christian theme, and we're going to move away from that to contemporary subject matter. We're going to move away from academic illusionism and naturalism to abstraction and experiments in styles. We're going to move away from the idea of the painting as this magic window that opens up a vista to you, to a painting that is surface, that is meant to be read as a painting. All of those things are very clear in Post-Impressionism. And so while there is a debate about which style is the first modern style, is it realism, is it Impressionism, nobody doubts that Post-Impressionism, we are definitely into the realm of modernism, and we're only going to get more experimental after that. And so we're going to see a proliferation of styles. It's not just going to be one style anymore, or one movement, or one idea. We are approaching a true democratization of art, where it is motivated purely by the artist and the market. Whatever the market can bear, whatever people can buy, and whatever they can sell will become the determination of where the art market is going to go and where the artists go. And so it's not a client or a patron relationship anymore. It's going to be organized and kind of controlled by the artists who are making this movement happen. It's also important to know this is an extraordinarily political age, and it increases as we get into the early 20th century. We're not going to quite get into the 20th century in this lecture. The next lecture, we're going to go full on into the 20th century, and oh my gosh, it will just be dizzying. There's going to be so many different movements and isms, you can't keep track of it all. Fortunately, I have a little timeline that will help you understand how it kind of overlaps, but we're not quite there yet. So let's talk about Post-Impressionism. Just to back up to show you where we were. Remember, 1874 we have the first Impressionist exposition. That happens, and we have art that looks like this. Art that is very loose in brushstroke, was very radical for the time, but it's still trying to capture that optical veracity, that impression of nature. And yet, within 12 short years, this is what's popping up at the exhibition, at the eighth and last Impressionist exhibition. But this is not trying to capture an optical veracity of nature. It is obviously a construct. It is intentionally fake. It tries to, highlight its fakeness with you. It is a construction. That tree doesn't look like a tree. It looks like a swarm of bees. This is something that is given over to the style. And you can see this dramatic change. This first wave of Post-Impressionists we often call Neo-Impressionism. This was the Neo-Impressionists. That just means new Impressionists who were thinking about how do we create an impression in a new way. And you can see this radical change in Pissarro, this was the painting that the mythical Monsieur Vincent said was looked like he needed to wipe the dirt off his glasses before he did it. But here you can see he's genuinely trying to capture the impression of a landscape. But Pissarro by the 1880s is painting like this. Notice how everything is moving. Notice how every single thing has been divided up into a dot. And that's because he himself was impressed by this new generation of neo-impressionist painters that dominated the last Impressionist salons. The last Impressionist salon shows a clear break with Impressionism and a move into something else, something new. So let's talk about these guys. One of the first and foremost of these is Seurat. Georges Seurat is an interesting painter, and he is a French neo-impressionist. Clearly he was in the camp of the Impressionists, he is influenced by them, but he pushes it even further. He develops a technique that we call divisionism. That is, you break everything down into tiny little pieces. He called it chromoluminarism, but we more commonly know it as pointillism. Pointillism is where every single thing is made up of a series of tiny little dots. And these dots are all different colors that fuse together to create new colors. And this is in large part inspired by the work of Michel Eugène Chevreul. Chevreul was a chemist and a teacher who wrote a book, The Principles of Harmony and Contrast of Colors, where he basically argued that, color is perceptual. Rather than color being real or actual, it's perceptual. And if you take two colors that are very different next to each other, and you back away far enough, those colors engage in what's known as simultaneous contrast. And that means they will produce a third color, or a unique color. And in fact, this is a very important scientific discovery because this is what gives way to all modern printing. If you've ever seen printing, printing is done with just 4 colors. Modern printing is CMYK, which is cyan, yellow, magenta, and black. K took me the longest time to figure this out, but the reason black is K is because K stands for key, or the key color. And with just those 4 colors, you can mix dots in the right proportion to produce millions of potential colors. It's the same thing on a television screen or your monitor. Your monitor only really produces 3 colors, red, green, and blue. But those red, green, and blue dots blend together to produce the millions of colors that you see on your handheld devices, your screens, etc., everything else. That's all you need. And so from very simple colors, a lot of complex colors can be developed. So he was fascinated by this kind of scientific understanding of color, and he sought to reproduce it in his paintings. You can see in some of his earlier works, he is moving in this direction. But he's still painting in what would be regarded as an Impressionist style. His color patches are very, very small. They're very, very teeny, but they're still color patches. You can actually see his brushwork here. If you look down in the details, you can see that his brushstroke here is directional to indicate the grass. It's horizontal here to indicate the water and the movement of the water. It's little patchy stuff to indicate the clouds. There's a variety of different stroke widths and sizes. They're much smaller than something that had been used by Pissarro before this, or a Monet or a Renoir. But there's still a kind of color patch. But you can see that his strokes are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and he's beginning to experiment. And that's where he really crosses over into his divisionist technique. And here in his divisionist technique, you can see this entire thing is made up of largely uniform dots. There's no sense of brushstrokes in this. In fact, people look at this and they say it's bizarre. It looks like a print. It doesn't look like a painting. Everything is made of tiny little dots, and this does some strange things. Like I said, it transforms this tree into something like a swarm of bees. It also gives an artificial quality to the picture. Nothing is dimensional. Everything feels kind of flat and plastic. This woman's dress in the center is reduced to a cylinder. It's the kind of painting that you can't even really appreciate until you get very close to it. When you get very close, you can see the numerous, just millions of tiny little dots necessary to make up this technique. If we go back and if we look right at the boundary layer of the shadow of the oak across the grass, it looks like we're essentially dealing in two more or less uniform colors. But if you zoom in on that section, holy cow, what a difference does that make? You can tell that in the dark green there is red and blue and purple, all combining together to give the impression of green. Likewise, in the light green we have a darker green, but we also have highlights of orange and yellow and white. Backing up again, taking a look at that from a distance, it doesn't seem to have that kind of complexity. It reads as more or less a kind of uniform surface. It kind of dazzled. It has a little energy around the edge, almost like snow in a television screen. If anybody remembers snow anymore, I guess there's horror movies, so that's why we remember snow on a television screen, because everybody's gone to digital screens. There's no snow on digital screens, but on the old screens you can see snow, and it gives it this pixelization, this kind of energy, and that kind of vibrancy comes through. You can see this in his paintings. This painting really was an incredible painting, so much so that you can see that he includes Le Grand Jatte in the background of this other painting with his models. What this does for the painting as a whole is rather remarkable. It moves it out of the category of the real, honestly. It doesn't feel like an Impressionist painting where a person is painting au plein air, trying to capture the moment. And in fact, he wasn't working au plein air. Seurat worked in a studio. He would go out and make sketches au plein air, but he would come back to the studio to finish these paintings. So the great revolution of the landscape painters and the Impressionists, where they took their painting outside and painted directly from life, is no longer necessary, because he's not trying to convey life. He's trying to convey something else. It's such an interesting scene, and not just because this woman has a pet monkey, which is fabulous. It's that in addition to it feeling kind of unreal, kind of plastic, notice that the figures don't really engage with each other. They all stare off in directions. You only have this really girl here who indicates any kind of movement at all. Everyone is noticeably still. There is a kind of alienation of the figures, even though they're all out there. They're all out there enjoying a Sunday afternoon in this park. They're there to see and be seen and to enjoy it, and yet it feels strangely remote, oddly distant. There's a kind of social commentary going on here. If you've ever seen Sunday in the Park with George, Stephen Sondheim musical, it's based on this painting, and it depicts these people living lives of quiet desperation, kind of in isolation from each other. And I don't think that's an accident. I think that Stephen Sondheim nailed it, that is what is trying to be conveyed. Here are a group of people who are all together, yet somehow still alone. It's interesting. It does have this artificiality and coldness, unlike other things that we've seen before. And all of his paintings have this. There is a characteristic kind of alienation or detachment. Here we have this circus sideshow, and in the circus sideshow we have a band playing in the background, a trombone player is up front, but he has these impossibly skinny ankles. The figures are far more stylized. They're not realistic figures in any way. They are prototypes or archetypes of figures. They are constructions. The artificiality has been elevated. And that's the thing about post-impressionist painting. Photography took over the role of naturalism. Impressionism was a bold effort to kind of capture naturalism in a new and fresh way and technique, but ultimately they decided that's not what painting is for. Painting is to express the internal, not to record the external. And this is what this is. It's an expression of the internal. You can see a little bit more how all of this comes together in this wonderful series of dots. The technique distances you from the subject in a way and becomes increasingly more artificial. You can see that in one of his last works. Alas, Seurat, who became one of the more influential painters of the end of the 19th century, himself died very young, and as he died, a lot of his works were unfinished. But when you look at this composition, notice how the figures are perfectly perpendicular to the picture plane. They stand up rigid, and they sit down, I guess, but their bodies are rigid and perpendicular to the picture plane. They're utterly flat in the background. We have a lack of depth. Instead, what we have is something that feels very much like a cardboard cutout. He is moving away from reality. One of the other painters that was active there at the last 8th Impressionist exposition was the French neo-impressionist Signac. Paul Signac was, again, a divisionist. He had a close partnership with Seurat until his sudden death in 1891. He actually went to the 5th Impressionist exhibition as an attendee and was deeply impressed by Claude Monet's work and decided, this is where I'm going to go. And he was actually working on a variety of sketches. An unfriendly Paul Gauguin kind of came up to him and saw him copying one of the painters, and he says, "We do not copy here, sir," which was a great suggestion. That was a great inspiration to him. That you don't learn by copying past masters. You learn by innovating. Okay, and so he started working almost on this kind of scientific understanding of imagery, breaking down the figures into tiny little dots to create sensations of color and movement. What I like is that towards the end of his career, he abandoned the need to kind of depict anything real at all. And this is when the titles start to get really pompous. This is Opus 217, Against the Enamel of a Background, Rhythmic with Beats and Angles, Tones and Tints, Portrait of Monsieur Félix Fénelon in 1890. You gotta love that title. What is this background? It's a complete acid trip. It is literally what he says it is. It's rhythmic background with beats and angles. It doesn't exist for any purpose. You can see this move towards the fake. You can see this movement towards the intentional construction. And we start to call this move symbolism. That is, the goal is no longer to create or recreate nature or to create narrative. And if we do create a narrative, the narrative may be twisted, and in fact we wish it to mean something else. It's about reinterpretation and assimilation and adaptation. And so here he is creating a kind of symbolic portrait of Monsieur Fénelon. And it's very different and quite eclectic. We'll talk more about this in a bit. One of the next great post-impressionist painters would be Toulouse-Lautrec. Now, Toulouse-Lautrec is such an interesting character. First of all, he suffered from a disease, and so he was born deformed, which meant that his legs never fully developed. So he had a full-length torso, but very short legs, and that meant that he never got taller than 4'8". So, I mean, I've talked about my apprehension about my frame here, so let's just say he wouldn't intimidate me. I'm short, but I'm not that short. But he was an interesting character because he was actually nobility. This is something many people don't know about him. He was actually next in line to be a count. And would have inherited the title from his father had he not died young and before his father. So what's interesting is he actually came from money. Another one of these bohemian characters who decides to slum it comes from money but decides he wants to live on his own. What's interesting is he actually could. He was one of the few artists that was very, very successful in his lifetime, but he was not successful so much for his paintings, but for his graphic design and his posters. So we'll talk about those. He was one of the innovators of what would become Art Nouveau. It wasn't really necessarily called Art Nouveau at the time he was doing it. And he made a career of creating posters for very famous performers in cabarets and nightclubs that existed at the time. The most famous, of course, being Jane Avril. He did lots of posters of her, and in fact, she gave him credit for his fame. She said, you know, she was no slouch herself, but she said, without the posters, no one would have ever known for me, and he gave credit to him. So this is one of the most famous posters that shows her as part of this cabaret, and you have to love that he has turned the head of the conductor here, and the musician holding the upright on what I assume is a bass, bass-stringed instrument, and yet he has wrapped that around and turned that into the border. All of this is done by hand. He did this by hand. These were turned into lithographs, and they were mass-produced. And he had so much work as a person making posters and graphic design that he actually had a very substantial income from it, and that allowed him to explore time in painting. So it's funny, came from money, but he didn't need it. He actually was very successful. People always comment how wonderful these are. They're very simple. They're very flat. Again, there's probably the inspiration of Japanese art as well, and Japanese printmaking. Beautiful, just loose, but also still very evocative, handwritten text and hand lettering. We have this wonderful kind of figure here who's almost cut off at the head with the long black gloves. Elegant figures here. There in attendance with the musicians at the stage. You have to love the Dutch angles. Dutch angles means these crazy tilted angles. That's a term from film studies, from cinema, where you would tilt the angle to create anxiety in a film. But he was doing that in print. Great stuff, gorgeous stuff. But I love his paintings best of all. I think his paintings are just fabulous. His paintings, again, have much of the same emphasis. There's more emphasis on line. So unlike the Impressionists and the Neo-Impressionists who were breaking everything into a divisionist technique, he instead brings his graphic design knowledge into this and re-emphasizes the line. You can see that almost all of his figures are outlined in either a dark outline or a heavy line or bead of